Hello, I'm John Brink, and we are podcasting on the Brink in downtown Prince George. And we have a very, very special guest today who is located today, at least, in Denver, Colorado. And her name is Laura Renner. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
So, just a little bit of our location for our guests internationally that are watching us from around the world is that Prince George is in the province of, it is in Canada, in the province of British Columbia. British Columbia is a big province. We are physically in the middle of British Columbia, about 500 miles north of Vancouver. And then another 500 miles further north would be the Yukon border. And next to the Yukon is Alaska. And then we are also in the middle from east to west, about 500 miles from Prince Rupert, and then 500 miles from Alberta, which is the province over next to us. And it's a beautiful area here, lots of forest. Unfortunately, we had quite a bit of forest fires this year in particular, more than we have had ever, really. Forest fires are not uncommon here, but this year in particular in Canada, we have had a lot of forest fires, partially because global warming and all the other things that are associated with it. And but for the rest, it's a beautiful area, lots of lakes all around us, probably 50 to 100 lakes all within 10, 20, 30 miles from here. And, and then the city of Prince George, relatively young, was incorporated in 1914, became a boom town really because of all the natural resources in the industry, and gradually developed to be a city of about 80,000 people. But the area around us has probably another 70, 80,000. So it's the center of northern British Columbia. And so personally, I came here to this city in 1965 from Holland. And then it was a boom town. And I came with very little here. I had $25.47. And the dream of wanting to build a lumber mill, which I did, and some other things. So, I love the province, and I'm a Canadian, and I sometimes still go back to Holland, but I love it here. And so that's kind of a little bit of the background. The other part that is important in our discussion is because you are very special in in the areas, and I get you to explain that, but being, having a medical background, being a neonatal nurse, and then obviously what we have in common is ADHD. And so maybe I'll just let you kind of explain to our listeners your background, if you can, Laura.
Sure. So, it's interesting. My life really changed completely in December 2021. I was working in my job as a neonatal intensive care unit nurse. At the time, things were, seemingly pretty good, I thought. And then I had an innocent accident. I fell while playing with my friend's kid backwards onto this like stone marble structure, and I hit my head. And in the moment, I didn't really think much of it. As a nurse, uh, I would avoid the hospital at all costs. So I figured I'm fine. I think things will be okay. And went to bed that night. The next morning, I woke up and I had significant bruising underneath my eyes. And the area that I hit was the back of my head. And so I knew, oh gosh, I must at least have a concussion, if not something worse. But I was still seemingly, okay. I ended up going to the hospital, and at first they were like, you seem fine, but I guess we'll give you a CT scan, which is a way to get imaging of your brain just to be safe. And at the time, I thought, great, they're going to clear me, send me home, I'll be on my way.
That's
And
a scan, right? They do
yeah,
of your
yeah,
brain to just
mm,
make sure there was nothing obvious. Yeah. Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, just to make sure that there wasn't any significant injury or whatnot. But
Right.
unfortunately, there was. And I had massive bleeds on my brain at multiple levels that were pushing my brain down and towards the left, and would ultimately, by the next day, my neurosurgeon said, would have killed me.
Ooh. How did you find out that part? Because they did the initial scan. Did they do an MRI afterwards? Or how did they detect that there was damage to your brain? Very significant, obviously. How is that because of your condition that you then found out, or did they do other investigations?
Good question. So initially, they just did the CT scan, and that was basically looking for something like a bleed.
Right,
Um, with time, I ended up having an MRI and other testing that did show a more significant brain injury,
right.
and I developed more symptoms. But at the time, they were purely just focused on the bleed, which meant that I had to have brain surgery. And, working for almost a decade as a neonatal intensive care unit nurse, I was used to being in high stress environments and functioning. And so
Obviously.
initially, I thought, okay, I can get through this. And I was totally in denial. It hadn't really set in what happened. And then I had the brain surgery. It went well. And I spent a couple days in the ICU, went home.
So the brain surgery that you had, now they knew that the brain had pushed down, moved to one side. So how did he enter? I always think, brain surgery. Oh, would scare me really. And you being having your medical background, your nursing emergency background, so that's very invasive, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I had almost 50 staples in my head. It was almost a 4-hour surgery
On what
where,
location? And
so
just out of curiosity.
yeah, so it was back here. It's about a 6-inch scar that kind of curls around all the way under my ear. And so, yeah, it's about 6 inches. Thankfully, my hair now covers it. But for the longest time, I had, staples, and there's still a pretty significant divot from the surgery itself. But I ended up having 3 titanium plates put in my skull. And yeah, it was definitely a significant surgery. But at the time, between being a nurse and having a history of trauma, I was really just in survival mode and keeping my head above water, which I was doing successfully. But then after the surgery, especially as more complications arose, it really set in how severe and intense it was.
So the surgery alone was, you say, 4 hours?
Yeah, just
Yeah.
under
And
4 hours.
and then you being an emergency nurse that has been in that type of an environment, did they explain exactly before that as to what was the objective of the surgery and what it likely would do and the potential risk involved and all? Were you fully aware of what they were
Yeah,
trying to do, why and how, and what the surgery would accomplish?
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
So at the time before my surgery, cognitively, I was very functional. So I completely understood what was happening.
Right.
And they explained it very thoroughly, and also explained, they were basically going to be performing surgery within my brain, and there was a risk of death, but also a risk that I might not come out the same. And after the brain surgery,
Ooh.
I did experience a lot more significant traumatic brain injury symptoms, such as I had issues speaking. I lost the ability to do math. I had difficulty finding words. On top of also just, migraines, pain, nausea, all the things, really everything set in after
What
that
was
surgery.
was it in San Diego that you had it done, or?
No, it was all in Denver.
Oh,
So
okay.
thankfully,
Denver kind of is your hometown in a way, or?
Denver is my home. So I've been here for 12 years. I'm originally from Rockville, Maryland, which is in the Washington, D.C. area, but
Okay.
I've been here for over a decade. So I call Denver my home.
Good hospitals, right there.
great
Yeah,
hospitals.
because
Yes.
Denver is the capital city of Colorado, right? No?
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's Denver's a big city, so thankfully we have excellent hospitals.
Okay.
And the hospital that I went to is especially skilled at trauma and neurosurgery and does
Okay.
this very well. So it
Okay.
worked out in my favor.
Okay. Just I interrupt you a little bit there as to what then happened next. Is
Yeah. So after my surgery, I experienced a seizure. I experienced a potentially life-threatening reaction to a medication.
so again asking a question. A seizure is where a person goes into, you know, a kind of a
Yeah,
coma and starts to physically what happens in a seizure.
right. So basically, the electrical activity in the brain starts firing almost like haphazardly. So it's
Right.
not firing in the way that it normally would. So that leads to loss of consciousness, stiff muscles, shaking, rigidity, things like that. So I
Right.
had what's called a grand mal seizure, which is that type that you see in, on TV or in the movies where it's the person loses consciousness, they start shaking, drop to the ground, things like that.
Very potentially very serious, right?
Yeah,
Get to the hospital right now.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when that happened specifically, that was just about 2 weeks after my brain surgery. And I remember I was sitting with my boyfriend, he was cooking dinner, and all of a sudden I just felt something's wrong. I just knew it. I couldn't identify what it was, but I just felt something was wrong. And he kept trying to calm me down. I have a history of pretty severe anxiety, so he was used to that and just thinking, "It's okay, just try to relax." But I just knew, I just felt it, something was wrong. And I ended up having him call it's called a nurse line. So it's essentially through the hospital that I went to. They have a 24-hour uh, nurse phone number that you can call where you can basically walk through what's going on with you, your symptoms to see if it's emergent or not.
Correct.
And so while Andrew was on the phone with the nurse line, I lost consciousness and had a seizure. And when I came to and regained consciousness,
You in the hospital.
uh, there was the EMTs, the ambulance people were in my condo, and I had no idea what happened, which is normal after a seizure. Your
Yeah.
brain doesn't really know how to pick back up, and so I had no idea what happened. I started crying. I couldn't identify what day it was, what year it was. I didn't know, the standard questions that they ask you to see if you're what's called
Yeah.
alert and oriented, if you know
Yeah.
where you are. I couldn't answer anything. I knew my name, but I didn't know anything. And thankfully, that was short term, but still very scary. And so after the seizure, I experienced I was put on anti-seizure medication, and I experienced a reaction that's called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which it had the I think the percentage, it's a 1 in a million chance to get this type of reaction, and that can potentially be fatal. But
So
thankfully, we caught it
I'm not
early enough.
I'm not familiar with that. I know the seizure, but the one that you said that it has the potential. How did you call that again?
So it's called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and it's something I only knew it from being a nurse. It's not common.
No.
It's something that there's about 10 different groups of medications that can cause it, and it starts as skin rashes and can work its way up to, you know, skin tissue death. Really can be scary, but thankfully we caught it early enough. But
Is it a
another just
reaction to medicine?
Yeah, so basically,
Okay.
the medication I was on, it was called lamotrigine. It's an anti-seizure medication,
Okay.
and my body basically started to create an inflammatory response against myself. So it basically
Rejecting it.
yeah, and so my body started attacking itself instead
Okay.
of, well, just having things be normal. But so
Ooh.
so another scary thing happened, and
Right.
then to top it off, about a month after my brain surgery, I was having these continued CT scans, so continued imaging to make sure that everything was progressing. the surgical area was resolving and whatnot. And I ended up developing a new brain bleed and was facing the potential for another brain surgery. And this just broke me. It was the whole time, I was really just fighting to be out of this depressed state.
Correct.
And that just brought me to the lowest depths I could be at. And already I was struggling with pain and just knowing if I'm ever going to be, the same and come out okay healing my brain injury. But now I was facing another brain surgery, which meant there was a possibility things could get worse.
Can I ask you again what you said? Now you discovered that you had, and maybe another. So what did you call that again?
So a new brain bleed. So I had
Uh,
bleeds on my brain that I had to
okay.
have surgery for initially.
Yeah.
And then while I was healing, another blood vessel in my brain, broke. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but
Right.
I developed a new active bleed that was getting bigger. And so if that had continued, I was going to have another brain surgery.
Right.
And at this point, yeah, I really just hit my rock bottom
Yeah.
and I was completely hopeless, having panic attacks, just thinking nothing good is happening. Everything bad is going to keep happening to me. And one day I just had this realization just kind of drop into my mind that if I don't change my mindset and my outlook, then I really might die. And something's got to give here. And that sent me down this path of healing my mindset, healing my anxiety, and ultimately that led me to trauma healing. So I knew that my job was traumatic. I saw, unfortunately, a lot of death and a lot of really intense things working in the neonatal intensive care unit. But I didn't realize how much trauma I had in my childhood and in my adulthood at other points that I had just never recognized or dealt with. So I just went deep into pretty much every trauma healing modality that I could find and spent pretty much the next year after that, which now coming up on a year and a half, um, just devoted to healing trauma, healing my mind, and healing my body. And it's really been, I mean, incredibly powerful, incredibly challenging at times, but it's been the best journey that I've been on. And I know it's crazy to say to some respect, but I'm really grateful that the brain injury happened because had it not been for that, I would have kept living this life of basically just I was in this constant acute stress response in survival mode where I was working, constant overtime in just overdrive at work, never resting, never sleeping, getting very drunk, doing a lot of drugs in my off time. I was just going a million miles an hour, basically as a way of covering my pain and covering all of these undealt with traumas. And with time, I was able to heal a lot of that and recognize that. And so, had it not been for the brain injury, I don't know if I would have stopped living that way.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what would have done it otherwise because you didn't want to deal with it directly, and certainly not indirectly through counseling, and so you just, I'm imagining, were burying it as something that didn't exist, but it did, so, and
Yeah.
at some point, it would have to be dealt with, right? Because otherwise, between other things that you were doing, the extreme amount of work that you were trying to do to hide it, in combination with other things like alcohol, maybe drugs and other things to bury all of that could only last so long, right? And then other things potentially could happen directly around you, like relationships, and all these other things potentially would become in jeopardy, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting because the 5 years prior to my brain injury, I I went through a divorce. I broke my back twice. I broke my wrist. I had
How did you do that?
so
Were you
all through different things.
riding
Yeah.
horses?
No, no. So the first time I broke my back snowboarding, and the second time I had what can only now be determined as a seizure in my sleep. And I had four fractures in my thoracic spine, which is about my high mid back area, which is very hard to do because your ribs um, are attached to your thoracic vertebrae, and so it's
Right.
really hard to break your thoracic vertebrae. And so they, but it was in my sleep. I went to bed after work and woke up in significant pain, and turns out it was that. And also during this time, I developed a blood clot in my lung, and this was all. I was a seemingly healthy, active, fit person in my early 30s. There was no explanation, and I underwent all of this testing to see why I was breaking bones easily, because I broke my wrist falling in a parking lot, and just all these things were happening that couldn't really be explained. And I just kind of moved forward. After everything happened, I just said, whatever, I'm just going to keep living my life. And so it literally took this brain injury for me to wake up and just realize how unhealthy I was living, and how I was just masking all of this complex trauma that I just had never dealt with. And it's interesting because through all of this, all of the various trauma healing modalities I've explored, all of the research I've done myself, all the books I've read, everything, I didn't realize just how much of the qualities that, at work, for instance, were I was praised for were actually trauma responses. I was always dissociated from my body. I never really slept. I didn't really need that much caffeine. I was able to just go. I never rested. I was just that fidgety person who always had to be doing stuff. And it was good. It was great. I was able to be very productive and help a lot of patients and my staff and things like that. But it was all basically just a technique of making it so that I never had to sit with my thoughts and sit with how I was really feeling, because when I did, it was just too painful and too cruel and too mean. So I did everything I could to avoid myself.
And so then all the while you were a nurse already and working as an emergency nurse during that period?
Yeah, so I was what's called a charge nurse
Yeah.
in the neonatal intensive care unit nurse. So we took care of premature, very sick babies. And I worked on night shift. So I was basically in charge of my unit. So I would help out other nurses. I would go to the deliveries of the premature babies. I would help with pretty much everything. I kind of had my hands in a lot of things at work, but I was really good at it because I was really good at functioning in really high stress environments. I could just emotionally shut it off and just work. And I would just keep going because I knew, to me, I was always putting other people before myself. To me, I don't need a break. Other people can have a break. Like I would do whatever I could to make other people's lives easier, because to me that was the norm, functioning in this incredibly, hyperactive nervous system state was what felt good to me, even though it didn't. It's what I was used to, and my body and my brain were so just adapted to that lifestyle.
You
And
were
through,
you were a can-do girl,
yeah,
always there, always ready.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I was always the first to offer to stay late to help or
Yeah.
to pick up extra shifts, and just, I would always do whatever at the expense of myself, not realizing it was at the expense of myself. I was essentially, functioning as a martyr, and it was all good intended, but it actually came from this significant trauma that I experienced as a child. I had a near death experience. I had sexual abuse at a young age. I was bit by a ton of dogs. Basically, I had all of these, individualized, some complex and really awful, and some really minor experiences, but all of them together created this lack of safety for me, where
Right.
I didn't feel safe with myself. I
Or
didn't feel safe with
secure.
caregivers.
Yeah.
Right. And so my body basically just was always I was always anxious. I was an incredibly anxious child. And my parents,
Defensive, right?
yeah, and they did what they could. They helped me get therapy and anxiety medication, and my mom even took me to a hypnotherapist. She tried so many things to help with my anxiety, but it sort of helped to some degree, but it didn't because I never really addressed the source of it until last year. And it was interesting because I never realized the severity of my anxiety until the last year. And it was always something, oh, yeah, everyone's anxious, which I know a lot of people can identify with anxiety. But I was just so used to it that I could kind of spin it and make it functional. And as I've healed a lot of that, oh my gosh, it's wild to look back to think about the person who I was and how just nervous and worried and scared I felt so much internally, but I would just avoid it. I would avoid it through work. I would avoid it through addiction to exercise. I would avoid it through drugs and alcohol and all the things because I just didn't know how else to deal with it. And I was able to do that in a seemingly functional but dysfunctional way.
So if I look at this, then this is all not all that long ago. It's 2021. It's only around 2 years ago. Then how are you doing physically with your brain? Obviously, the bleed did not require surgery, and so they did. I'm imagining I'm not a medical individual other than having been exposed to a lot myself, but they then established that the first operation combined with the other ones kind of brought you back to, at least from a injury repair, back to your brain is back to functioning, but not exactly the same as it likely was before, I presume. And then there is a connection to ADHD that comes into the picture as well now, but that you may not have discovered before, or how it connected to the injuries and all the other things that happen along the way to you.
Yeah, so great question. So yeah, so I thankfully did not have to have another brain surgery. I ended up going on essentially what was called a modified bed rest at home. So I couldn't even do housework. I was basically just sleeping, sitting on the couch, trying to function, trying to do as minimally possible to not overstimulate my brain so my brain could heal. And over the course of a month, the bleed resolved, which was amazing. And during this time, though, unfortunately, because I was so restricted from a stimulation standpoint, that's when I really started to experience a lot of the cognitive deficits. So, couldn't do basic addition, couldn't do any math whatsoever. I really just struggled with word finding. So I was constantly saying I could not for the life of me find, words that I used on a daily basis. I struggled with processing. I couldn't really understand. It would take a lot longer for me to understand what people were saying and what they meant. And it was bad. It was scary. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I had moments of thinking, am I doomed? Am I destined to just be this way forever? And thankfully, I came across the beautiful concept of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to adapt and mold and rewire itself based on how you utilize it. And so during this time, I was seeing a speech therapist and an occupational therapist to help with all of this. And I knew if I just put in 1000% of the effort that I can into getting excuse me, getting speech back, getting math, getting all of these things back, that I can do it. And I was able to, for the first time in my life, really have a positive mindset because I was someone who always struggled with negativity. And I just knew I have to believe that I can do it. And during this time, I got really much deeper into meditation. I started visualizing my success, being back at work. And over a 6 week period, I was able to go from, my lowest points of function and speech and math to being able to do really high or much higher complex levels of math. That's the only thing that really hasn't come back, which is fine. I used to be excellent at math. I could do a lot of complex problems in my head, which I can't anymore, but it's also not necessary for my daily life, which is okay. But it took about a 3 month period to get to about, I would say, 80% of my speech baseline. And now I'm fully back to where I was before the brain injury in terms of thinking, speaking, processing, and all of that. And that's also required a lot of consistent practice, which is, the beauty of the brain. And if you establish that consistency, it'll rewire itself in the best way. And so for me, I was able to really double down on all of the therapies that I was doing to heal. And through all that, I realized how it was no longer a good fit for me to stay as a neonatal intensive care unit nurse, because when I really started getting deep into, healing trauma, healing my brain, focusing on rest for the first time in my life, I was able to recognize how I had no boundaries at work. And even I came back to work too soon, for sure. I was still struggling with math. I was struggling with speech. I was struggling with migraines and noise sensitivity and a lot of things. But I came back in even a limited capacity. I was working less hours. I was not doing any complex roles. It was very minimal help, but I was still pushing myself too hard. And even when I would have these migraines and just feel terrible, I would still do whatever I could to try and help my coworkers and help other people and put them first. And I just knew, if I'm going to heal and really get through this brain injury, I can't be in this position anymore. So I decided last June of 2022, I left my career in the NICU and I started writing. And that's when I started the process of writing my book, which published June of this year, which was great. And it's interesting how I thought for the entirety of my life that I was going to be in the NICU, in the neonatal intensive care unit. I thought I love this job. I love everything about it. And of course, there's still a lot of elements I love, but I've learned that, yep, and that's my book. Exactly. It's called No, I'm Not Fine, Thank You.
Yeah, and I find the title, obviously now in particular, very appropriate and very interesting. And so what it is no, I'm not fine, thank you. And so it deals with those issues precisely what you were talking about. And did it give you the sense of satisfaction to be able to put that in a book form? And obviously, as I well know, I'm also an author, although at a later age. I wrote, I don't know if I can reach it here without pulling. The first book that I wrote is this one, Against All Odds. Mm-hmm. And was an interesting book, and I have similarities with you, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Let me talk about the book first, because psychologically, probably I was driven the same as you were in a lot of ways, is that it's not about hurrah, John, how successful he has been and all the businesses that he has and all of that sort of thing. It's not about that. It's about the journey, the ups and the downs, so. And that's what makes it unique. So I wrote this. It took me 80 years to live it, 20 years to think about it, and 2 years to write it. There's quite a bit of a challenge to, as you well know, to put together a book. And, so I did it. And it has everything in it, from the good, the bad, and the ugly. But in particular, you can do it. And that's what I always believed. And I'm going to show you this one here because it means a lot to me. Is my sign that my employees made for me, $25.47. But it's more important is that the foundation of my life is attitude, avoid the negative, passion, and work ethic, but will follow, at least in my world, is success. And so, and then the other thing that I was here already in Prince George. I was not a success story in Holland, and I'll tell you a little bit about my background in terms of, I was born in 1940 and the northern east part of Holland during the war years. My mom had 3 kids. I was born in November 1940. A sister that was 1 year older and a brother that was 2 years older. My dad was drafted into the Dutch army in April of 1940, and we didn't see him for 5 years. They didn't know if he was dead or alive. The last they heard from him that he was caught in the bombing of Rotterdam, where they bombed the whole center of the city. Thousands of people died. And then for the next 5 years, we were under occupation. And in particular, I still remember from the time that I was 3.5 years old, with bombers overhead, where up to 300 bombers day and night would be going over Holland, particularly the area that I lived, bombing Germany. And we would stand on the roof deck, not because we wanted to look, but my mother felt safer outside than inside. We see in the distance all the cities burning. And then in particular what was difficult, the liberation or the winter of 1944, 1945. It was called the Hunger Winter. And a lot of vulnerable people, young and old, ones died. There was no food. And I still remember as a kid, we would go in the mornings with gunny sacks to the railroad yards, pick up anything edible and burnable. Wow. The reason that we did it as kids is because the Germans wouldn't shoot us, but they would boot us one, and then we came back the following day. And but I still remember from it is that hunger, I can still feel it. Cold, because the winter 44-45 was the coldest one on record, and and a lot of kids in particular and older people died from hunger and cold. And so the other one was heat. All we had is a little stove, everything, we couldn't heat anything. We sit around the stove and I can still feel that part of the heat of the stove. And, and then we were liberated by the Canadians, actually on April the 12th, 1945. And I still remember, the Canadians coming in, and I knew from that point forward I would go to Canada, to the land of my heroes. But what we did see is far too much, where bodies were all around, a number of people were shot, and we would see that number of people were executed in the area where I lived. I still remember a little card where there were legs and hands and all of that all that stuff that you as children, or anybody for that matter, should not see. So, and then, from there on in, I was not very good in school. I failed grade 3. Well, nobody fails grade 3. I gave a presentation the other day, and a lady way in the back said, "Yeah, I failed grade 3." I said, "Okay, just the two of us then." But anyway, and I failed grade 7 3 times. And I felt I had been a failure. And, because in Holland, it was that if you want to get a job someplace, then it is, where are your diplomas? Well, I didn't have any diplomas. And, but even so, I was already quite successful actually in the lumber industry. My dad managed a small lumber mill for the company. I worked with the head company, and I already had a very good position, but I felt I was a failure. And I felt I had to start all over again, because I knew I could do it, on my own, and that I was good at these things. And so I wanted to start with nothing. I left Holland on a plane was $150. And then by the time, obviously, I got here in Prince George, I had $25.47, but I was going to build a lumber mill. How did I end up in Prince George? Is simply that I couldn't speak the language. Obviously, in grade 7, they don't teach you English. I couldn't speak the language, I didn't know soul, and I didn't have a job. And by the time I got to Vancouver, I went to the immigration office, and fortunately there was a German fellow, I could speak some German. And I told him what I wanted to do, build a mill. He said, go to Prince George. It's a boom town, that's where the opportunities are. So I went to Prince George, and when I came off the bus, a couple of blocks away from here, actually I had this I had in my pocket, and and then from there on in, it took me, and this is really the point that I want to make, and that's why I believe our conversation is very interesting for both of us, is that I went to into a bookstore here, and I still don't know why. I picked up this, it was 1997, I was already 57 years old, very successful already. I'd built a number of companies, and everybody said, oh, you're so successful, and I didn't feel that way. I felt still I had been a failure. And I walked into the store, and I picked up this book, Driven to Distraction, and I looked at it, and it said, ADHD. I never heard of it. And I bought the book, and I wrote in the book, now I finally know who I am.
Wow.
I was ashamed of it, right? Because of the stigma, because that's a mental problem. I thought, there I'm building these companies, and I go to the bank, and I want to borrow money, lend money, and then I say, okay, by the way, it's a good business plan and all that kind of stuff, John. It looks terrible. Yeah, and then I say, another thing I have to tell you that, I have a mental problem they call ADHD, and they say, have a nice day, right? So, so I could not say much about that, so I kept it. And then it took me a long time from that point forward, till about, another thing that happened then, I had the problem that I was a failure, even if I was successful. I had difficulty communicating with people, other than at my workplace, maybe 2 or 3 people. And then by pure coincidence, my ex-sister-in-law dragged me down to Toastmasters. You familiar with Toastmasters?
I'm not.
No. Anyway, it is an organization, interesting organization actually. There's probably 400 clubs all around the world. Probably still 40 million people that have been exposed to Toastmasters. It gives you the ability to think on your feet, to become a better speaker, create confidence in people, and then the highest level you can reach in Toastmasters is becoming a distinguished Toastmaster. But it gave me also confidence. I'm at the highest level of Toastmasters, and I'm saying that simply by illustration. And so that, in combination with finding out that I was ADHD, changed my world. And then what I felt after the book, Against All Odds, I started to include it. I do a lot of public speaking. I'm a professional speaker now, amazingly, speaking on all kinds of venues. I felt I became more vocal about speaking about trauma, but also about ADHD. And then what I did 4 years ago, in my late 70s, after I did the book Against All Odds when I was 75, I wrote the book. I felt I had to talk about it more and write about it. So I wrote the book ADHD Unlocked. I wanted to write it from the mind of somebody with ADHD. And amazingly, and you might find that interesting, I'm a very good writer. And I always have been. and I'm very good at numbers and always have been. And so I wrote this, become very popular, speak about it more, and if I do presentations now, I include the issues that were trauma. That this is not only for people that have ADHD. It also is directed, I believe, my opinion, that ADHD is a superpower. It allows me to do 20 things all at once. And the other part about it is that, it makes me a slow learner, or somebody that if it does not have my interest, then it just passes me by. And that's what, sitting in the classroom for 4 years and where I'm only interested in a certain area, that I just don't have the patience or the ability to sit there. I can listen to somebody speaking for an hour, I haven't got a clue what they talked about. And, but at the same time, I'm very, very good at doing the things that I do like and where my passion is. So I wrote this, and then talking also about slow learners or people exposure to trauma, that should read this book. I believe that the frequency of occurrence, at least in my opinion, I don't claim to be an expert, just from my opinion, is that I always thought the frequency of occurrence is maybe 8%, and what people said, I believe it's much closer to 20%, if not higher. And, and I believe it's not a liability, it is an asset, and if you know how to use it, then it can become very effective in your life. So what the other part that I did, and just again talking about trauma, that is so important. So if I look back, even for me, struggling with unresolved trauma from the past, the war years in particular, the hunger, the anxiety, and all the things that were around, the fear. So I got counseling for at a very, probably more closer to the time that I was 60, for the inner child. The fear of losing the one person, so.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's why definitely it's important. Now, the other one I was going to show you is then, so now I'm on the roll, right, with writing books, because I want to talk about other things, so my mind, right? So the other one that I wrote, it just came out actually recently, is that I believe that to have that passion for me, I wanted to go to, my dream was to go to Canada, and I did, then to prove that myself that I can do it, I'm not a failure, to start from nothing. And I did that, and then at the same time become a good communicator and help others. And then the other part that I always found is that there are so many people that do not like their jobs and can continue to work in environments that they don't enjoy or don't like. And I always say, if you do that, and a lot of people have excuses, they say, well, I've got mortgage, I got this, that, and so therefore I cannot do that. I say, find things that create your passion. And then, because whatever you do, it affects everything around you. And the amazing thing, some of the statistics in the last couple of weeks I heard from the United States, is that 70% of the people do not like their jobs. And 75% of those are looking for other jobs. But this one I wrote with that idea in mind, saying, finding your passion, living the dream. And then the question is that, so John, are you living the dream? I say, absolutely, I am. And so I wrote this book. It just came out a couple of months ago, and then it was grade 7, not bad, huh? So the point that I'm making is that everything is possible, but to go through, to find that confidence through all the years of feeling that I had been a failure, at least even in my own mind, although I was quite successful. And then during that period, having periods where I was drinking more than was good for me, I had a period where I took Xanax for anxiety and all of those things, but then kind of trying to stay on the course, and now at 83. Oh, the other thing that happened to me is, I nearly died in 2008 when I had a case of diverticulitis that had breached and nearly killed me, and that kind of stimulated me to go to the gym, and whatever I do, I usually give it all that I got, and started training for about 10 years until somebody said to me, "Have you ever thought about competing?" At mid-70s, I said, "Yeah, me?" And so I started looking at training, and so I competed here in northern BC, became second in bodybuilding, third in physique. That qualified me for the provincials, and came in the same, and then that qualified me for the nationals and the Arnolds.
Wow.
And then came COVID, and then now today, again, I'm training at 80, nearly 83, November the 1st, to compete again, in the north, then provincially, and I believe I will likely succeed in becoming successful nationally, and again training in the Arnolds. Arnold already knows about me that I'm coming, So
That's amazing.
and so the point that I'm making is that, and as I listen to you, the connection of ADHD, the trauma, and then how the things affected your life, is so important. And I felt I had to share with you the similarities that I see.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And wow, I mean, you've accomplished a lot, but I love what you said about you can use your ADHD as a power, as in a powerful, positive way. And I completely agree. I feel like I, as a charge nurse in the neonatal intensive care unit, I think I was so successful mainly because I could navigate, 1,000 tasks at one time and always be thinking about a million different things, and I could do, and I was so good at it. And I can see how growing up in school and in nursing school and really in so many places, the areas where I didn't have interest is where I didn't succeed. But then the areas that I did have interest in, I was incredibly successful at, and I could harness that power. And for my writing process, it was similar. I learned, oh wow, I'm actually a decent writer, and I can sit down and do this because I'm interested in it and I enjoy it, and I can utilize this in the best way. But then, there were many parts of the book writing and publishing process that I didn't enjoy, and I struggled with those, and was able to push through. But it absolutely is a superpower. And I think, my trauma story and my brain injury story and just a lot of my life, I feel it didn't just happen to me, but it happened for me to grow, and it happened for me so that I can share my story to also help others. And that was just like you. I wanted to utilize my experiences to be an example for others so that they can do it too, because so much of healing trauma, shifting my mindset, and just believing in myself for the first time, really in my life, fully believing in myself, I've been able to shift and transform in so many ways that I never expected. And it's been a great learning process about myself and pushing myself out of my comfort zone and doing a lot of things that I would have let anxiety and the fear and all of that hold me back. But through this process, I've been able to embrace it and allow it to push me in different directions for the better.
Yeah, it's amazing, Laura, because there is virtually not a day that goes by that I will not encounter somebody that says that I've really never told anybody this, but I got ADHD, Or last week I met somebody that said, thank you for giving me the book. I give quite a few of them away because I think it's so important to do that. And that person said, I have a son that is 15 years old struggling with ADHD. I got your book. We read it together.
Wow.
Amazing, if you really think
Yeah.
about it. The other part of the connection is that it's never quite clear to me as to, in my mind, I was born ADHD in my mind, and I'm certainly not. I don't, and I think the trauma in terms of first child and the warriors and the other trauma that I was exposed to through counseling to a certain extent, I was able to, in a child in particular, immensely emotional, as you likely know, to deal with that in consultation. And when it happened during a period that we had challenges in our relationship, and that we were in counseling for the relationship, and then that the counselor said to both of us, now my wife is saying that, actually I want to talk to John about the inner child. And so we decided to do that, and immensely emotional, but very, very helpful in a way, And so that's why I'm saying too that a lot of people have, men in particular, a lot of times feel they are too proud to get counseling or whatever, that I say, that it's an important part of, trying to, in difficult, complex issues in life, in particular now, to be open to counseling or, to be able to communicate about it is very, very important. And
Yeah.
as you've
I
done
completely
in your
agree.
book, so.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think, and for me, a big piece of it was, even though I'm someone who I've done counseling for the majority of my life, but I still thought I was pretty good. And I was someone who always said, I'm fine, even when I wasn't, even when I obviously wasn't. My
Yeah,
natural response, because I think that's how a lot of us are, we just say,
me
we're
too.
okay, yeah.
Yeah, I
Even when
do.
I'm, sobbing, I'm like, I'm fine, but I'm not. And so that
No,
was why I wanted to title my book, No, I'm Not Fine, Thank You, because I think to one degree, we don't want to burden people with our problems. We feel like, oh, I don't want to make someone else feel bad or feel responsible for my feelings. But also, I think a lot of it, at least for me, and from a lot of the people that I've spoken to, it's also just we're afraid to deal with it because it's hard. It's not easy going through all that. And I've done a lot of inner child work myself, and it's so powerful. The outcome has been amazing, but that was some of the most challenging therapy work I've ever done in my life because
yeah,
a lot of the root causes of a lot of the issues or things going on with me were due to a lot of childhood experiences, and my inner child is just a very scared little girl who had a lot of bad things happen to her. So I had to do a lot of,
exactly.
creating that safety and comforting for myself so that I could, utilize that as my adult Laura and who I am now and grow. And I still have a lot of things come up related to some undealt with childhood stuff or things that just haven't fully resolved that I'm still working through. And yeah, some days it feels really heavy. And I've had a lot of moments of being like, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to keep, turning over rocks, looking for these hard things and having to work through them? But the answer is yes, because I know
Yeah,
ultimately it makes me a better person. It, I learned so much about myself through it all. And I know that healing has given me so much. And by sharing my story, if that empowers other people to heal, which I know that it has, I've had a lot of outreach, thankfully, about people who have, talked about how parts of my story related to them. Because one of the big things that I talk about in my book is how harshly I talked to myself and how I would shame myself. My inner thoughts were all just critical and harsh and painful. And, if I can make myself feel like worse than anything, then someone else can't hurt me. And if I can hide behind perfectionism and all these things, then no one else can hurt me. And it ultimately led to me hurting myself. And so by being very vulnerable and sharing my story, if that can help other people, then it's all worth it. And it's, if I can, kind of be that experiment for other people to show, okay, I go through, just like you said, I go through the ups and downs. It's not all just, oh, these are the things that worked for me. I had a lot of really significant setbacks during my healing process that it's painful to think about. It's painful to write about, but I know that it's powerful and it's worth it and it can help people. And so therefore that's why I did it. And that's been my goal, is to share my story and share my struggles so that there can be more change and people can be more comfortable seeking therapy and talking about these things, because a lot of us struggle with our mental health. And if we don't talk about it, it doesn't change. And so hopefully having more conversations like these helps with that.
Yeah, and especially being so open about it as you have been, as I am. For me, the rewarding things that is, I virtually see it daily. I got today an email from, or text message actually, from somebody in Holland. That sent the email and read the book, The ADHD, and said how thankful he was for it, and it changed his view, and all of those complimentary, and saying, my goodness, and the father who read the book and struggling with the son that didn't know which direction to go, and thinking of ADHD as a liability rather than something that it can be much, and those things are rewarding. And I talk about it in podcast, I talk about it in presentations that I do, and I really enjoy sharing it with people like yourself doing similar things. And I really appreciate you doing the podcast with me and about our mutual lives, and I'm certainly it will be an inspiration to others. And I like to stay in touch with you, and I very much appreciate it. Any closing thoughts that you have at this point?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much. This has been so great. I love hearing more about your experiences and how it's, contributed to your growth and success and everything. Really, just final thoughts is having more of these conversations, finding the people in your life, for people who are struggling with their mental health, anxiety, trauma, ADHD, things that they feel like may be a weakness, but it's actually a strength. It's really comes down to finding those people who you can connect with, whether it's people close in your life, close support people, or, communities online. I think finding people that you can relate to, that's been so huge for me, to not feel alone, to not feel isolated, to not feel like there's something wrong with me, to recognize, wow, no, all that's happened to me is powerful and I can turn it into a strength. And so I think for people that are struggling, finding that support and being open about it is huge.
Excellent, Laura. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for the podcast. We will stay in touch.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.